Good morning, everyone. It's a little after 9 o'clock. I'd like to call to order day 2 of the 2025 August meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. We will be in session here this morning as a council. We will adjourn before lunch to come back to the table with 2 different Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission boards this afternoon. We're going to be meeting with the policy board after lunch to talk about sector separation, and then the Bluefish board will join us after that. So we are just as a council now. My name is Mike Luisi. For those listening online, I'm the vice chairman of the council, sitting in for Wes Townsend, who his term expired just on Sunday. And the other thing that I would just want to make an announcement, and I'm sorry for those of you who have to listen to this over and over again, but we do have 4 sitting council members right now whose terms do not begin until Thursday morning. And so throughout the discussion today, I will be calling on the public. It is during that time that the new council members who will be sworn in on Thursday, who are sitting with us, will have the opportunity to engage in the discussion. And those 4 council members also cannot vote today. It's going to be a little interesting this afternoon with votes with the boards, but we'll work through it like we always do. We'll get through it. And so that's kind of the outlook for what we're dealing with today. We're going to start with Jason, with council staff, is going to be providing us a presentation on Illex specifications for 2026 through 2028. And whenever you're ready, Jason, go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're potentially just looking at status quo Illex specifications. And I was a little worried. I was talking to Chris before the meeting. It's an hour-and-a-half agenda block. And he said, well, you know, there's some interesting stories to tell with Illex. And so roll with that. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Overall, and it's kind of, it was, I initially was going to try to keep it really a chronological kind of progression. That was kind of hard to do, but hopefully at the end, you've got a sense of where we are now, how we got here, and where to next. So on the where are we now? Current 2025 fishing year, it's a calendar year. We're at an acceptable biological catch, ABC, of 40,000 metric tons. That was set up by the SSC, the Scientific and Statistical Committee, in 2022 and 2023. And looking back at their notes from 2023, their report, essentially it looked at 3, you know, we don't know exactly what the biomass is. We don't have reference points, but they looked at some potential reference points. And whether you look at the risk of exceeding a fishing mortality to natural mortality ratio, so fishing mortality less, ratio of 0.667, 2/3, or the risk for getting 50% of the fish kind of escaping beyond the fishery, or 40% escaping, those risks all looked relatively low. 21% for that exceeding fishing mortality, the natural mortality ratio of 0.667 was 21%, and then 16 and 7% for the risk of exceeding those, of getting less than those escapement amounts. So that kind of is, you know, we don't have an exact biomass estimate for Illex. We don't have reference points, but the SSC looked at a couple different ways to kind of look at some potential reference points, and 40,000 metric tons looked okay. So then that's kind of the upper limit on catch. Getting to the quota, it's a bit less. Technically, we call it the quota, it's a domestic annual harvest, or DAH. We start with the ABC, subtract discards, subtract any potential research set aside that's been suspended for a number of years, and then the remainder is this quota, or domestic annual harvest. And you'll see in a potential motion later, we also have things IOI, initial optimum yield, DAP, domestic annual processing. And those are kind of a bit of relics from when we had foreign fishing. If we didn't specify that the U.S. fishery could fully catch and fully process all the available yield, potentially we had to set aside fish for foreign fishing. Those are somewhat relics of when there was potentially a foreign fishery, but we still specify them because potentially with Magnuson, if we weren't expecting to fully utilize it, we might have to do that. So what do we subtract for discards? Currently, we're subtracting 1,369 metric tons. And how do we come up with that? Well, this set aside for discards really only matters when the fishery is getting close to harvesting its full yield. If the ABC is 40,000 metric tons and the fishery only lands 10 or 20,000 metric tons, it doesn't matter a whole lot what we set aside for discards. It's going to vary a bit, but it's not going to get anywhere close. But we looked at there were a couple high production years right before COVID, before we really lost a lot of observer coverage. And some of those numbers became more uncertain. And 18 and 19 were high production years. We took the average of that. So it's not like that number is going to be perfect. It's not like we couldn't have an ABC overage, but it's kind of a good faith effort to say the fishery is actually getting close to harvesting, around 38,000 metric tons. If we'd set aside this amount for discards, we're probably not going to go over 40,000 metric tons. So where are we right now in 2025? This is, we're kind of in the middle of the Illex fishing, hopefully the middle of the Illex fishing season right now this year. So that the vertical lines on the NIMS quota monitoring site are a little funny because they go every month and a half. So if you go in between April and July here, that's about June 15th. So the fisheries kind of started ramping up right in mid-June. We're not near the quota right now, but it is about 60% higher landings than 2024's total was. And you can see in 2024 in the yellow there, the fishery started around July. So these last year was a relatively low production year for Illex, but more on the meaningfulness of any given year later. So how did we get to this 40,000 metric ton ABC, and kind of what has the fishery been like? I didn't go like all the way back, but I went back to kind of around when I started the council, looking at the 2008 specifications, and it noted that there are squid records going back through the 90s, likely Illex landings back into the late 1800s. Until in the late 1960s, the then Soviet Union started seeing more squid bycatch, and that kind of kicked off the foreign fishery. And so in yellow here is when the foreign fishery was mostly operating. You can kind of see that ramp up in the 1970s, anywhere between 15 and 25,000 metric tons. And then Magnuson stopped some of the foreign fisheries, but since there wasn't really a domestic fishery, the foreign fishery for all mackerel, squid, butterfish, I think, but definitely for Illex, hung on for a bit longer. The domestic fishery is that gray line that you see starting to come up right around 1980, and then the foreign fishery was totally phased out in the late 80s. So how was a quota set back in 2008? Now, it was described slightly differently in the specs, but this is basically what it boiled down to. We had some stock assessments that said 24,000 metric tons was probably okay when the stock was high, but 24,000 might be too much if the stock size was low. But the only time the fishery is probably going to catch around 24,000 is when the stock is high. So 24,000 metric tons is probably okay. That was kind of the essence of how we were setting the quota in 2008. Although it mentioned that that's really not the best way to go about it. You'd really like a real-time assessment and management, being reactive to kind of the current conditions that the fishery is seeing on the water in any given year. But we're not there. We don't understand the dynamics. We don't have the data to do that. And maybe down the road, which is some degree where we're still at right now. We think we've maybe making a refined estimate compared to back then, but we still don't have the tools to really know what's going on in the water right now. And that we've kind of stayed to targeting 24,000 metric tons until 2019. In 2018, the SSC bumped the catch up a little bit. And looking at that SSC report from 2018, they noted several stakeholders in the fishery presented information to the SSC and argued passionately for an increase in quota based on their observations of the distribution and abundance of Illex squid. So I went back to see who were those stakeholders, and for any of those folks highlighted, I don't think anyone will doubt their passion, but also you would not want to. It'd be impossible to overstate the passionate argument of the late senior Captain Rule, who was there. And so the SSC they bumped it up a little bit. They said, yeah, that information really wouldn't sway us a lot off, but there was a bit of rationale to bump it up a little bit. But they noted that, we haven't had a stock assessment for this in a long time. And there's a strong sense among both the SSC members and the stakeholders that a collaborative approach to collecting and analyzing existing and new data may provide a way for the SSC to work with industry partners to find a way forward. And that kind of eventually gave birth to the Illex working group. And it was, we kind of took this, I took this back to Chris. He's like, okay, what can we do? Are there some ways that we can react to this in some fashion? And we're able to pull Paul Rago in on a small contract. We created this Illex working group with some of the council members, some industry, and eventually got to where we are now. And Paul later is going to present kind of like where we are today with the quota. And what Paul presents today is really has been a sequential refinement of what he initially did back in that Illex working group. So he's kind of refined it maybe not every year, but every couple of years. That Illex working group results made their way into an Illex research track assessment. And then it was kind of this collaboration between industry, the science center, and staff here, trying to figure out, like, can we move to it's still maybe a rough estimate, but is it a better way to look at that? And that's, it's a little hard to see on the right, that circle. You can see those quotas increasing over the last few years. And that's really a result of that Illex working group, but really, industry and Jimmy coming forward at that SSC meeting saying, hey, we will do what it takes to kind of help you understand this fishery better. And that kind of kicked things off. So a little more information just on kind of recent operation of the fishery. This is just since the mid-90s. A lot of noise is what I see there. This fishery kind of oscillates a lot from year to year. The 2017 to 2021 period was an unusually high kind of series of 5 years. It was pretty much unprecedented for the domestic fishery, and even the solid years for the foreign fishery were not at this level, although there is a lot of uncertainty about what the foreign fishery catches actually were. In terms of price, it's been an overall steady increase in price. It can vary a lot year to year. There's, I'll mention later, the Illex fishery is just like a drop in the bucket of the global squid market. So as that changes, so does the price that U.S. processors are able to charge. Where does a fishery occur? Tori Kentner on staff has really helped us do some more with some kind of just easy updating of fishery information with her GIS skills. But if you look at, since there's fewer vessels and it's not always super active, we do get some confidential data year to year. But the darker blues here are where the fishery operates more intensely. These are 5-year blocks. So pretty consistent where you see the most activity off of Delmarva, but it stretches really the whole shelf. And again, these are just 5-year blocks moving forward in time. So it can bounce around a little bit year to year, but pretty consistent where this fishery operates. This is just 2024 for the last slide in terms of what stat areas. I think it may have been about 20% of the catch in 2024 may have been in those totaled confidential squares. So when does this fishery occur? And so you'll see here right now, the regs and the quota monitoring website have it closing at 94% of the quota. I think may have identified just last night that there may have been a reg tweak that occurred with some like things expiring in the Federal Register. I think that's actually 96% maybe, and I'm just having this morning some back and forth with Garfo to try to figure that out, but I think we'll get that ironed out. So this year and last year, again, summer fishery. It's been ongoing since mid-June. Last year was mostly July and August. Here's 2019 and 2020. These were kind of a couple of these boom years. And you can see, again, it's kicking off in mid-June and then ran until mid to late August when it closed in 2019 and 2020. But looking back a little, again, it's the same quota monitoring reports on NMFS's website. Here's a year where it didn't close, but kind of ran pretty much all the way through October. So, last year, the fishery basically shut off in mid-late summer, but sometimes it can go all the way through into August. There's a lot of variability year to year with this fishery. Just in terms of number of vessels that participate, there's about 74 limited access permits. Some of them are kind of quote unquote on the shelf in confirmation of permit history. And it's kind of hard, it's a little harder to track exactly what the total is because vessels can be moving in and out of that CPH confirmation of permit history. But it's just about 74 limited access permits. And you can kind of see in the late 2000s, it was about 10 or 15 vessels. The fishery was kind of at a low point in the early 2010s. More vessels in those kind of high years, 17, 18, 19, 20, which is about the same number as we're participating in the mid 90s. So there are a few vessels that kind of fish this year in, year out. And then depending on the strength of any given year, you have more vessels kind of jumping in. The council, I'm not exactly sure how many years ago now, maybe 5, did do an action to potentially requalify and limit the number of Illex permits because they were seeing, even with those 20 to 30 vessels participating in the late 2010s, the fishery closing early. That amendment was disapproved by NMFS for a variety of reasons, kind of focusing on the fishery doesn't always achieve its quota. The quota was expanding, and NMFS decided that it was not aligned to Magnuson to further limit participation in the fishery at that time. Okay, so there's a little synopsis of where we are now and kind of how we got there. And I do think it's kind of a neat story of a lot of collaborative work. And Anna will touch on after this, mostly on some data collection, but that effort also gave a rise to what's called the Squid Squad. There's a group of kind of management and industry and academic and researchers at the center who kind of had a call most Fridays to kind of try to get a sense of like what's going on in real time with the squid fishery. So that initial kind of call to action back in 2018 has kind of really given rise to some neat ongoing collaboration. Okay, so where to next? I'm going to kind of give some input from our advisory panel and then kind of summarize the staff recommendation to the SSC, and then Paul Rago will summarize the SSC's findings. So you have the full fishery performance report from our advisory panel and the briefing materials. I'm just going to go through and highlight a number of bullets from that. So the AP flagged that market conditions in 2024, and we kind of asked the advisory panel to focus on the most recent year, were kind of pretty similar in terms of Illex demand. They flagged that 2024 wasn't as good as those 5 banner years, but the freezer boats that were going out, they still went out, they still caught Illex, there were still Illex out there. The advisory panel has flagged that diesel prices being elevated in recent years have been a challenge to them, not just from the vessels operating, but the freezer plants and keeping fish frozen. The diesel affects the dynamics of that also, and limits what they can offer to vessels for prices, because their prices were higher. This, again, they really emphasize that other squid fisheries dwarf Illex. I think I noted in there that I went and looked at the Argentinian Illex fishery is like 400,000 metric tons. And I'll take a brief thing that I found that's kind of interesting. So let's see, if we go to Marine Traffic is a website that tracks vessel AIS. And so once vessels, I think, are maybe beyond 12 miles, they can turn it off. So like we don't see the U.S. Illex fleet out there. Sometimes someone will leave it on. Most of the time when they're out there, they'll take it off. I think these are a few Longfin vessels south of Nantucket. But if you scroll over to off of Ecuador and outside of the Galapagos EZ, I think this is a distant water squid fleet out there. Not all the vessels that are out there probably even have their AIS on. If you Google like distant water squid fleet Galapagos, there's all kinds of YouTube videos that I don't know, their accuracy, but it will give you a flavor of what that fishery is like out there. But again, a lot of vessels out there. If you look, I'm not sure if off of Argentina right now, if this is the Illex fleet or some other fleet, but these are big, large vessels, and a lot of vessels. So again, just kind of emphasizing that our squid fleet is kind of small in terms of these global squid fleets that are operating. Okay. So they flagged there were also some cold bottom temperatures that they saw in 2024 that I think it was more of an issue with Longfin, but they flagged it also for Illex. And the main message the advisory panel is communicated is that, recent years low is just like not so distant years high. It's just typical variability of this fishery, and not to get like over concerned by the swings year to year. They continue to flag that U.S. suppliers continue to invest in infrastructure to produce quality product. They request continued involvement of fishermen to try to get into this understanding of what's driving this year-to-year variability. Anna Mercer, who's presenting after this on SQUIBS, which is data collection focused, did a presentation in February 2023. So there's a link in this presentation or in the fishery performance report. Is a great overview of kind of what the Squid Squad does. For folks who are kind of newer and haven't seen that, I highly recommend going in and listening to that presentation. The AP flagged that with the ABC increasing, if that closure threshold, if we start hitting it, and that seems like it's too much, consider kind of reducing that closure buffer in the future. But overall, they recommended status quo measures seemed appropriate. They flagged keep an eye on the swordfish catch and limits. There's an incidental catch of some swordfish in the Illex fishery. And I think they got HMS to tweak that and bump it up a number of years ago. It hasn't been a huge issue, but they kind of want to keep the council aware that we don't want to be discarding swordfish if they start to bump up on that. And they continue to note both the squids were recently recertified by MSC for sustainability, kind of reflecting this kind of ongoing churn of advances with Illex and Longfin. Robert Rule at the table here was also at that advisory panel meeting and flagged that in 24 there's a good body of good sized Illex in June and July, more in the southern area, but sharks, not spiny dogfish, but bigger sharks made fishing there impossible. There's warm water in there. And so like, it's one thing to kind of like see that on paper. Oh, there's this kind of like a lot of sharks disrupting fishing. But he did send me a video. Hopefully this plays. So this was in 2024 around the southern part of Norfolk Canyon, and just the amount of sharks in the water is just like really impressive to me there. And you can imagine how that number of sharks can potentially cause gear damage, and they just can't fish down there. And he may have some other kind of observations he wanted to add to that, but it was impressive to me that video. Okay, so a few little updates, miscellaneous. The center provided an update of their indices, and some of these go into Paul's analyses we'll talk about later. This is the Science Center's spring trawl index and the fall trawl index. A lot of noise, but it is interesting. We definitely saw a bump up in that spring index in some of those big Illex years in a few years ago. So given all that, the staff recommendation was kind of looked at the council's risk policy. The council's risk policy, your risk policy, advises caution about any ABC increases when you're lacking a defined overfishing level, like we are with Illex. The center's analyses, that again was kind of extending what Paul had done, suggested that around 40,000 metric ton catch probably still has a relatively low probability of causing problems. Might be a little riskier than when we looked at it a few years ago with some updated data. A slightly higher chance of getting of not getting at least 50% escapement. A slightly higher chance of exceeding that fishing mortality to natural mortality threshold, but still relatively low. So staff recommended status quo to the ABC, for the ABC to the SSC, and I'll turn to Dr. Rago for his SSC report.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. I really appreciate the kind words on my small contributions to all this process. Also, just wanted, for the sake of the council, just wanted to remind everyone that I have in the past and continue in the to recuse myself from all the discussions of the SSC during these the deliberations. So Michael Wilberg serves as chair during that period. So next slide, please. So I try to maintain an arm's distance with it. But the squid really is it's an amazing animal, and it lives for less than 1 year and spawns once and then dies. As Jason described, it lives a lot of its life cycle offshore and off the continental shelf. And there's a very short and variable fishing season. They arrive in the oftentimes in the late spring and leave mid to late fall. Now that generally falls just in between the research surveys. And so this very strong influence of oceanography is also an important feature. And all of these factors kind of lead it to what we colloquially describe as a model resistant stock. And between fishing years, you're not fishing on a cohort that was there before. You're fishing on the children and grandchildren of the cohort that was there in the previous year. So the research track assessment, which was was not successful in developing an analytical model, but it assembled a lot of information from biologists, oceanographers, modelers, and I think perhaps most importantly, the fishermen who participated during the entire process. And we'll hear more about that from Anna in her presentation. But, that was really one of the keys to unlocking a lot of the improved understanding of this. And so next slide, please. What we kind of developed is to say, okay, well, we don't know a lot of things, but we can kind of get some handle on some of these things through these various discussions. And so some of these key uncertainties included, like, what fraction of the stock is on the continental shelf. We call that availability, and that varies between years. Secondly, what is the efficiency of the survey net? How does that compare to commercial gears? Can we describe this in any way that is useful and put some error bounds on it? What kinds of experimental work can help you bound, so to speak, the efficiency of the net? Natural mortality is a really big one. You can see that with all those sharks in the water, the lifespan of a lot of those squids is truncated, and we think, and most of the evidence suggests aging, that these are what are called subannual species. That is, they live less than a year. So they have to have a unique life history strategy where they're reproducing pretty much year round. But we don't really have too much evidence of that year round behavior because they are mostly offshore. And then finally, how precisely can we estimate the relative abundance, that is the standard error of those from those fishery independent surveys, and primarily the fall National Marine Fisheries Service survey. So the scientists, industry, oceanographers, we really spent a lot of time at the research track trying to refine these estimates into a set of plausible ranges. Next slide, please. So the basic idea with this envelope, so to speak, approach is to get a range of all the plausible values for these key unknowns. So we envelop all the ranges and look at ultimately what their consequences are for things that we're interested in, such as escapement or biological reference points or fishing mortality. So, we begin with historical time series of survey biomass and catch. And we use a relatively simple model. It basically is the Baronoff's catch equation. We use that as a way of not only estimating fishing mortality and population sizes, but also using it in a hypothetical way of what we call escapement. And that's basically, if you took that population, what would its size be if you didn't have the fishery? That is, you simulate forward what the population would have been without the fishery and compare it to what it was with the fishery. The ratio of those two is the escapement, or estimate of escapement. So you're seeing how much did you perturb the population by harvesting. So we look at all the possible outcomes over all possible combinations of the input variables. And so this is done with a, it's a computer intensive process, but it's integrating over all the possible ranges of those variables and providing some measure of the distribution of outputs that you're interested in. We'll talk about some of those outputs in a moment here. So the next thing is to, we compute bad outcomes with respect to escapement and ratio of fishing mortality to natural mortality. Now, this is oftentimes used in management of forage fish species. And so a general rule of thumb is that if F is greater than 2/3 of the natural mortality rate, then that could be a problem. So essentially, it's a way of saying who gets what with respect to the share that goes to the natural environment, the predators that depend on it, versus man, humans, and removals. So now that we have this kind of perspective, we can look at historical catches and say, over the period of time for which we have observations, did any of those historical catches provide or indicate some sort of problem? So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect, which is important for setting the quotas, is to look at alternative future catches. And you're saying, okay, we can look over the past and say, had we harvested these certain fractions of catch historically, what would they have implied in terms of escapement? So it's a way of, I guess, a counterfactual, the economists might call this, in which we hypothesize a range of future catches, but evaluate them with respect to what they might have done given our observations of surveys and catches in the past. And then finally, we try to link this to the council risk policy in order to say, okay, what is an acceptable level of risk given where we think the stock is? So next slide, please. So I won't, you have, if you look at some of those reports, we've got hundreds of pages of graphs like this, but essentially it's looking at escapement as a response surface. So you have two variables there, catchability on the x-axis on the left and the availability on the y-axis. And so if the stock is unavailable, that is, has low availability and low catchability, then you're in that high red area. And as you move out and have higher catchability and higher availability, that is, more of the stock is on the shelf and the gear catches them with a greater probability, then you have low escapement. So you do this, a couple million times, and you get this graph on the right, which is the estimate of escapement. That's the sampling distribution of escapement over time. And the key point there is that it has a long tail for one, but most of the mass of that is centered around 0.8, 0.9. So that says, irrespective of the variation in this envelope, most of the mass, most of the concentration of escapement is well above 80%. And we can look at that as a time series in the next slide. Okay, so this is the percentiles of escapement over time. So you have year on the y-axis, x-axis, and escapement on the y-axis. And so that's the time series. You have measures of confidence around those points, which are the various dashed lines. But if you look at the median there, which is that red line, that's across all years, the historical level is roughly about greater than 70%. So there's a pretty high chance, and the median is about the median of the medians is about 85%. So if you look at all that, and because if we take an escapement policy of 40%, which is that dashed line below there, the historical information really suggests that it's unlikely that there was ever any kind of substantial risk with respect to this metric of performance. A second metric that we can look at, next slide, please, is the ratio of fishing mortality to natural mortality over that same time period. And again, the same kind of principles apply. In most instances, that ratio is very small, on the order of 0.15 or less, and often in the 0.05 kind of range, and very little evidence, even with the extreme values, that it has exceeded 0.66. So that kind of gives you where we were in the past with respect to this. So you can do this thing with respect to where we might be with alternatives, and you get a similar set of graphs and a lot of tables that kind of, they're in the various supporting documents for the SSC deliberations. They sort of look like the New York City tax tables, very complex, many pages and so forth, but they're designed to allow you to look up and see what specific risks are associated with specific levels. So it's very much designed to be a way of quantifying and also validating and archiving the decisions that were made. So next, I'll sort of get into the discussions from the SSC and some of the conclusions that were drawn. And they appreciated the fact that we do look at a large range of parameters, but noted that there are additional uncertainties yet to be evaluated, and I'll talk a little bit about those at the end. The median stock biomass in 2024 was the second lowest in the time series, but even with that, there doesn't seem to be any significant issues associated with that with that condition. There haven't, as Jason mentioned, the biomass exploitation and escapement rates really have varied without trend, which is good. The escapement has generally been high, and collectively, these pieces of information suggest that there's relatively small impact of the fishery on the exploited stock components. Fishing mortality also is less than 0.01 per week, which is very, very low, especially given the life history. So when we try to evaluate how to apply the risk policy, all of these factors suggest that it's well above a ratio of 0.5, which is kind of a warning sign within the process. But even if you do assume that it's half of PMSY, it's still not likely to be causing problems. And then finally, the SSC observed that compared to squid fisheries elsewhere globally, current ABC levels are associated with low risks of exceeding those escapement standards. Next slide, please. So the SSC recommended continuation of the 40,000 metric ton ABC, as Jason has described. It's consistent with a low chance of falling below the escapement level of 40%. And this is one that's used in other fisheries. And there's moderate, and as in the case of 22% chance of exceeding the F/M ratio of 2/3. It's the ABC likely to lead to a low risk of overfishing. There was some concern about increasing it beyond this level, particularly because of our lack of understanding of what does escapement mean. We haven't seen evidence that low escapement causes low stock sizes the next year, and the F/M ratio is pretty controversial in the fisheries literature. And then finally, this risk of overfishing with respect to where we are in the spectrum of total biomasses leads to a situation which we can't formally apply the council's risk policy. The appropriateness of the reference points has not been specifically evaluated for this stock. However, it is noted that for other stocks around the world, that these metrics have been used. So in terms of sources of uncertainty, next slide, please. This is my final slide. The lack of a peer-reviewed overfishing limit, introduces substantial uncertainty. The process that's been used has been reviewed fairly intensively by the SSC itself, but we still don't have that sort of independent validation, so to speak. The reference points for Illex have not been specifically available, but we note a lot of interannual variability. You saw some of that with respect to the timing the squid fishery, the Illex fishery between years, and the oceanography and its influence on the sequence of bad and good years. I mean, there's a lot of really smart people looking at that and trying to sort of look at the relationship between warm core rings and how much of the squid population gets pushed up on the shelf. And then repeating, the issue of understanding what escapement means. And then finally, there were some questions about, could we look at potential correlations between these availability, what fraction on the shelf, catchability, that's the efficiency of the net, and natural mortality, that's how long they live. So there were some thoughts that if we had better handle on that joint distribution, how these factors interplay with one another, we might have a more balanced perspective. But as of this point in time, we don't really have that kind of opportunity. So, just thank everyone for their listening, and appreciate a chance to kind of give a perspective on this really quite amazing animal, and look forward to answering questions if there are any. So thank you.
And I mean, I'll definitely flag Dr. Rago, modest as always, but it really was, after kind of getting the okay and working on the idea of kind of moving this direction with Chris, of approaching him and saying, hey, do you have some ideas of how to get out of this box? And as Paul usually does, it's like, yeah, I have some ideas, and here we are. And then also, again, great collaboration with industry. John Manderson back in the Illex assessment, trying to wrangle, again, Paul's exercise is really trying to put some bounds on a number of the key parameters and say, okay, based on that, where are we in this box? And industry and John Manderson kind of in the Illex research track really tried did provide some good information on what might those bounds be. That's it in terms of my presentation and Paul's, and definitely happy to take some questions on any of that.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Paul, for your presentation and report. So Jason bookended it pretty nice. But Jason and Paul kind of said, all right, this is all about status quo. We got a good story. We saw the behind the scenes work that was done. The thing that stood out to me the most was the video. It helps me, makes me second guess telling Sonny that I'd go out offshore with him for a night sometime soon. It just puts it into perspective. The folks in Ocean City could solve some problems pretty quickly with a simple trip over somebody's line. So thank you. Let's see if members of the council have any questions for Jason at this time. We'll start with questions. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both Jason and Paul for amazing presentations as always, and hats off to Paul for all of the dedicated work on this. I guess maybe a question for both of you, but obviously what Paul presented, there's some application of excuse me, the F versus M approach, as Paul noted, in other similar forage fisheries, and with squid. It sounds like in particular, I'm trying to, dig some memories out from a couple of years ago, but has there been an evaluation of sort of the success of those approaches in other squid fisheries? I mean, are there other, is there a similar, squid squad type of effort internationally that, looks at these approaches, just given the very unique life history of the species, and, thinking about how best to manage for, the needs of the fishery and the needs of the ecosystem?
And I'll take one shot and then ask Paul to chime in. We did a review at the Illex research track assessment of kind of global squid fisheries. There's been a couple good journal articles, similar review. And in my short take on it was there's one fishery, I think in Japan, where they have a good paralarvae juvenile index that can kind of accurately predict real time. Everything else is kind of these retrospective, trying to get a sense of escapement and attrition, and like a general conclusion that it looks like things are going okay for most of them. So it was hard to kind of pinpoint like many stories where you had pretty high confidence that they were tracking things in real time and had it down. That was my overall kind of sense. But Paul, you have any thoughts on Michelle's question or refinements to my answer?
Sure. No, I think you've characterized it well. Most of them, most of the squid fisheries are sort of one-offs, so to speak, sort of conditioned on the available data. And that available data is really kind of the key, because since they have such a short lifespan, you need some really high frequency data in between those sample points to sort of understand what's coming in and what's going out. And so when you don't have a good understanding, you don't have sort of what you would call in ecology or fisheries a population closure. We don't know how big the what the influence of our activities are on the population and where it is. So those kinds of things all sort of interplay. And as Jason mentioned, there are very few instances in which the value of the fishery is worth the intensity, the effort to understand it in a really mechanistic fashion.
I think another kind of component is that there's a lot of other aspects of management and regulations for this squid fleet. We only have 75 permits potentially. Again, some of them are on the shelf, not on a vessel. Some of them might be locked up in vessels that are, say, scallop fishing and are, at least under current regs, unlikely to be redirected to Illex. So there's a relatively small group of vessels out there. Combine that with the long distance to go get them, relatively high fuel prices, and I think that relatively low price for Illex, and there's probably a bit of a self-limiting feature because of, not that you can have no management, but because there's a relatively small number of vessels, and all the other restrictions and difficulty to access the fish, there may be, for at least Illex here, a bit of a kind of self-limiting function too.
Okay, thanks, Jim Gilmore, and then Rich, I'll come down to you. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Chairman, and Jason and Paul. That was outstanding presentation. It was really kind of the history you put together, Jason, was very helpful in terms of how this whole thing's evolved. And Paul, your presentation was great, because I think in the world of multi-species and single species models and where we've evolved to in terms of the management, it kind of goes back to a time when we used to manage a lot of things with this type of information, and it was really sometimes we did a pretty good job at it. And I think the fact that the fishery is maintaining itself is a testament to the fact that maybe some of that older school stuff worked pretty well. So it's really a comment for a job well done and that history lesson, and maybe a favor to Paul, if I could borrow his presentation from my fisheries management class at Stony Brook. I think that would be very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jim. Rich Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jason and Dr. Rago. It seems pretty clear from the SSC's work that the fishery has not much of an impact on the stock dynamics. But Dr. Rago mentioned that you can see quite a lot of interannual variability in the stock. So what are the thoughts on what controls this this productivity or recruitment, interannual variability in recruitment? Are there any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's some kind of environmental drivers. The Squid Squad has been looking at like little eddies that come off the Gulf Stream and how that may affect things, or injections of, you know, warm water from somewhere, cold water from somewhere. There's some hints of there what's driving it. I don't think we've kind of solved the question yet. Again, Anna may want to chime in now or later on some of the clarification if you have some thoughts on the direction that the Squid Squad has kind of been moving and trying to understand some of that environmental connectivity.
Bobby.
Thank you. No, I just want to, one thing that we do need to point out, it's not necessarily a downfall or a lack of production. It's really hard to tease out if it's an availability issue or if it's a production issue, considering how this is oceanic species. So it may not be that the production's actually down. It's just we can't see what's there because they're outside of the range of the fishery itself. So it's one of the many multitudes of things in squid that make it kind of a pain in the butt to deal with.
Rich, you want to follow up?
Yeah, that's thanks, Bobby, because that was my question. Is it the stock variability, or is it the survey lack of precision in the survey to be able to, that causes us to think that there's a lot of variability? But that was what I was thinking about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, I don't see any other hands. Oh, I'm sorry. Anna?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question about oceanographic drivers of Illex. We have had a pretty active research portfolio on what is driving Illex for several years now. Sarah Saloy, who worked for the agency for several years, was really the lead of that initiative. Unfortunately, she's no longer with the agency. I'll put a link in the chat to a publication that Sarah led a couple of years ago. And I wanted to flag that we do currently have ongoing research investigating the mechanistic drivers of Illex movement onto the continental shelf that makes them available to the fishery. That research is in partnership with the fishing vessel, the Durston, and we just completed year 2 of that research, and we'll complete year 3 next June. So for that, we're chartering that vessel and doing a dedicated survey across the Mid-Atlantic canyons, where we're investigating both distribution, abundance, as well as the reproductive biology. Mary Kate Munley, who's currently here at the Science Center, is leading that initiative, and happy to provide an update to the council if they're interested in that in the future.
All right, thanks, Anna. I just sent you a message to see if you were available a little early for your presentation. So just disregard that. I'll assume you're ready to go
Sure
once we
am.
wrap up with the squid specs here. Are there any other questions from members of the council before I turn to the public? Okay, this is the opportunity for the public to ask any questions or provide any comments. I'm going to start with our council members at the table who would speak as members of the public. Does anybody have anything they want to offer? Seeing none, let's go to the room first. I do have a few hands online. I will get to you. I'm going to start in the room. We'll just kind of do a little horseshoe around the audience here. We'll start with Jeff Kalin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Jeff Kalin with Lens Fisheries in Cape May. I just wanted to kind of respond to Michelle's question about other squid fisheries and escapement methodologies and so forth. So we lease 2 processing facilities in California, and we're active in the California squid fishery too. And there they have paralarval surveys that have been ongoing for a period of time. And that fishery is managed under an egg escapement proxy. There are some closed areas out there that help the squid keep away from the fishery. And there's a relatively short or narrow continental shelf. So all of those things combined, California Fish and Game actually manages that fishery. And we're members of the California Wetfish Producers Association, which has we certified that fishery under the MSC program a couple of years ago also. And one of the things with MSC is they're always looking for a PRI value, a point of recruitment impairment. And if there's no stock recruitment relationship that's obvious, you can't really do that. So what's happened globally now is MSC has taken the position that these escapement proxies can serve as your typical reference points of BMSY or FNMSY. So the escapement methodology that Paul was able to develop and evaluate for Illex here is being used in California also. It's another certified fishery. So I just thought I'd add that. I don't really have any questions, but just wanted to shout out to Dr. Rago, how fortunate we are to have you at the SSC, Paul, to be able to do these kind of evaluations. It's really remarkable work, and we appreciate it very much. So on the domestic squid, on the Illex, we just, as Jason said, we just recertified that fishery. So now it's certified for an additional 5 years. And there was a risk-based framework that was performed, which is an MSC process to push against the lack of a PRI value and so forth. And it came through with flying colors because of the work that Paul has done here. So we're in a really good place internationally with domestic squids. And it's helped us move into markets that, help us find the top of the market and bring the biggest price we can back to the fishermen. So it's a real success story. And so we support the status quo recommendation today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Megan, did I see your hand? Megan Lapp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. We also support the staff and SSC recommendation. And I did want to just let the council know about a couple more things that are ongoing at the moment. Can't say enough about the cooperative research program at the center, the collaboration with the SSC and with the council on this species. For years, Seafreeze had provided our grading data to the Science Center, lengths and weights for individual squid that we pull out to do grading for sales, because we thought it would be useful for science, but it was not able to be utilized because of formatting issues. And so we worked with the cooperative research branch of the center a few years back to get some measuring boards with electronic scales and tablets that when we do our grading, and other processors such as Lunds are also doing this, when we do our grading and sampling for our squid, that information is going directly in the same format into the Science Center's database. So they're getting all the lengths and weights of individual squids that we're measuring as part of our grading process. And that's also feeding into some of the work that Paul's doing, as well as another project that has been funded by the council to look at an Illex modeling scenario. So, it's been very, very good and beneficial both for the science and the industry to be able to do that. So we just want to, say thank you and for the council and the center and being willing to work with the industry to get good science, and really support continuing to do that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Megan. Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Eric Reed. I am the United States Commercial Fisheries Commissioner to NAFO, which is the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization. That is the management body for international waters off the Canadian border and across our coast. And I want to pile on and say thank you to Jason and Dr. Rago. It's really an amazing effort that they've done to support the Illex fishery and the industry at the same time. So I just want to, I've heard escapement quite a bit here this morning. That seems like an important point. So I just want to make, in case you have any angst about the 40,000 tons, I just want to add another escapement factor, which I haven't heard here yet today. So Illex is considered a single stock throughout its range, which goes well up into Canada, the Grand Banks, and to the Northwest Atlantic. So the NAFO TAC is 34,000 tons at the moment, and that is never caught. Just there's no fishery there. There's an artisanal fishery in Canadian waters close to the beach, but the 34,000 tons essentially is uncaught, which means it escapes almost 100%. So that means the total TAC for the stock throughout its range is 74,000 tons. If 34,000 tons escapes, that represents 45.6%. So there should be no issue about reaching the 50% escapement when you consider that 34,000 tons. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. I have two hands online. I'm going to take those two comments and then we're going to bring things back to the board for, the council. Please be thinking about make the motions that'll be necessary when we get back to the table. So the first person I have online was James Fletcher. James, if you're with us, go ahead and ask your question or provide your comment. Thank you.
My question is, why are we holding down to the 40,000 tons? We're constrained. Nobody in the industry is going to build bigger with that. And since it's only a 1-year crop, and Eric Reed brought up that NAFO, those squids swim. And just for the council's information, the 165-foot vessel could be constraining the boats that would go offshore with jigging. But wait a minute, jigging has been mentioned by the United National Fishermen's Association for a number of years, and the Science Center or no one else has gone out there and tried to jig. Now, there is one grant or whatever that is now for jigging, but it's not for Illex offshore. My point being, under the new president's initiative, there needs to be an all-out increase in the availability and processing. And as long as the council continues to go along the way it's going, we are not, or can the council tell me that there's anything in what there is now that will increase or double the production of squid? One, the 165-foot boat, do away with that for the squid fishery. Two, have an all-out jigging, because then you get away from the bycatch issue. United National Fishermen appreciate it, but we've got to do better. We have been going along to get along, and we are not increasing the productivity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, James. Appreciate the comments. Last, we're going to take Peter Hughes. Peter?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, you sound good, Peter.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Great presentation, Jason, Paul, everybody involved, Squid Squad. I mean, it's an unbelievable effort to try to better understand this creature, which we have very little understanding of. But some things that we have established is that the spring and fall survey fall outside of the directed fishery for Illex squid. So we don't know what there's out there. They're not directing for that species. Second, we have an understanding that it's one cohort of squid that come through the area. We don't know if 2% of that cohort comes up on the shelf or if 98% of that cohort comes up on the shelf. We do know that there's a NAFO fishery that underutilizes its ABC or whatever it's called in the NAFO terminology, and that's considered escapement. We also can't rationalize what escapement is. We do know that in June, everybody's catching the same size squid, generally between 90 and 110, 120 grams. And that the further we go out in August, right now, they might be catching, 160 to 180 or 200 gram squid. So we know that it's one cohort that comes through on an annual basis. Now, I support the staff recommendation of the 40,000 ABC. But my question is, in moving forward, because we have such limited knowledge of this species of squid, and it is considered, and I quote, a drop in the bucket, unquote, on a worldwide basis. Um, what if we're having a banner season? And we don't understand the seasonality of it because we go years without having much of a fishery, and then there's some years where we have these huge spikes in the fishery. And I'm talking about when these huge spikes occur. What in our arsenal or our toolbox do we have that we're saying, hey man, we're having an incredible year fishing, and it's today, it's the middle of August or the beginning of August, however you want to characterize it. And we're reaching that 94 or 96% that's going to shut down the fishery. What tools do we have available to us to say, whoa, let's step back a little bit, look at this more holistically on a worldwide basis, and increase the ABC because we're having such a good year? And shoreside processing, offshore processing has the ability to process and market these animals. So I guess that's my question in looking forward, not looking behind us retrospectively, looking forward into our future. And there may come a time that we're going to need to be scratching our heads a little bit and going, how do we increase this ABC on the fly? And I think that flexibility needs to be built into some of our fishery management plans, not all of them particularly, but some of them, that flexibility on how we go about increasing that ABC in season. So just a thought. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Appreciate the thoughts about that. I'm going to, well, Jason just raised his hand. I'll see if I don't want to spend too much time on thoughts for the future right now, but I appreciate you bringing up the toolbox idea, and let's see if Jason has an answer for you, maybe.
Well, again, in collaboration with council-sponsored and center-sponsored project, we are trying to advance Illex kind of modeling efforts to see if, again, maybe that expands things further. There is a provision in mackerel, squid, butterfish specs that Service maybe can comment on whether or not it might be feasible. There's this little in-season adjustment provision that says the specs pursuant to the section may be adjusted by the RA in consultation with the MAFMC during the fishing year by publishing notification in the Federal Register. That potentially may seem to afford some flexibility. They would have to have some rationale why it's not going to cause overfishing. So I don't know if, that's in there. We may have even used it a bit here and there for other things, but so I don't know, maybe that's something we can think about, Peter.
Jason, I'm appreciative of that, but by the time you publish something in the Federal Register, 30 days in this fishery is a lifetime. It just is. And by the time you would publish something in the Federal Register, the fishery may be over. So, it's a very hot and heavy fishery. We all know that. It takes place within a narrow window of about 3 months, and it's done. So appreciate that, though. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Petney is going to offer some thought. Mike?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Peter just kind of captured it. I think that, the challenge is how quickly, when there is those banner years, things happen very quickly. I was looking back at 2019, the fishery went from having caught 16% of the quota to catching over the quota in a period of 2 months. And, as Jason pointed out, the regulations do authorize us to make a change in consultation with the council. And that timing means we have to have enough information by effectively this meeting to make a determination that a change in quota is warranted. and then try to get something in place and still, as Peter said, still capture the timing that the fishery can utilize that quota. And so I think, to the point, while we do have that flexibility to make an in-season adjustment, I do think it is still too sort of procedurally limiting to get at what Peter is suggesting. And so, maybe through the Squid Squad and some others, I think we looked at this a few years ago. We looked at some measures that we could use and some triggers that we could identify or signals that we could rely on to make a change in a more rapid way. And so maybe it's time to take another look at that, because I think, looking at the data that Jason presented for this fishing year, things have ramped up over the last several weeks. It might be another 2, 3, 4 weeks before we know whether this is a banner year. It probably isn't, but it's when those signals appear to us in the data is already kind of after the fact for the fishery. So I think we need to work with the industry and the council and maybe look for some different ways we can approach this. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mike. I think we're going to leave this as an open-ended idea concept that we can follow back up with. Paul, I did see your hand. I'd like to get to the motion here shortly, but do you have
Sure,
something you want to add to just tie up that end of that discussion?
Okay, guys, just to tie up that end, we did look at real-time measures, and we did use the information supplied by Seafreeze for that purpose. We used approaches that were oftentimes used in, statistical quality control kind of measures that allow for real-time identification of real-time triggers. And I think the series of questions really described the answer as well, is that it's all a matter of acquisition of information, processing it, making a decision, and acting on it. That time frame is so tight that it's hard to, the feasibility sort of fell apart at that point. So thank you for the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Okay, back to the table. Joe Cimino, you look like you are itching to make a motion.
Yes, I'm happy to, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And given all the discussion so far and the great presentation, spoiler alert, if I get a second, I'm not going to look to justify this motion. So I move to adopt the status quo Illex specifications for 2026, 2027, and 2028 with an ABC of 40,000 metric tons and 38,631 metric tons for an initial optimum yield, the ABC minus 1,369 metric tons for discards and zero research set aside, as well as 38,631 metric tons for the domestic annual harvest and domestic annual processing.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We have a motion. Joe Cimino, second by Bobby Rule. Is there any further? Joe already didn't need no additional rationale. Bobby, good. Do you want to make any additional rationale?
No, the rationale has pretty much been explained to death here in the last few minutes. The only thing I would like to keep open is, depending on the outcome of the peer review of the squid work that's coming up in February, I'm perfectly fine with setting the specs from 26 to 28, but I want to leave the window open that we can revisit if we have a new tool available. So that's the only thing I'd like to add. Thank you.
Yeah, that is the case. So yeah, we'll have the opportunity to revisit with new information in a subsequent year. Okay, any further discussion on the motion? Jason, did you have something to add before we take the vote?
Just flagging, so the review in early 26 is for Longfin squid, but we do have these other projects, so who knows what percolates, but just in terms of like that particular review.
Okay. So we have a motion made on behalf of Joe Cimino. It was just read into the record. I'm not going to read it again. Eric.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chairman, very quickly, is the threshold going to be corrected to 96% from 94%? I mean, 2% is 772 tons, and that could mean a week's fishing for the fleet. So can you make that correction?
So I just noted that potential discrepancy last night, and we'll have to have some back and forth with the service to root out exactly what's going on there. But if it was an error, I'm sure it will get corrected.
Okay, thank you. Okay, back to the council. Is there any objection to the motion? Okay, seeing no objection, this motion passes by unanimous consent. Jason, is there anything else to come before us on Illex this morning?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're at 10:21. Let's break. We have Dr. Anna Mercer who's going to present at 10:30. So let's come on back at 10:30 and we'll pick up with Anna. Thank you. If I could ask that everyone start to return to your seats, we're going to get started again in in about a minute or two. If folks can please return to your seats, we're going to start the next item on our agenda this morning. Okay, the next item on our agenda today is an overview of SQUIBS, the Longfin Squid Data Collection Program. We're going to get a presentation from Dr. Anna Mercer from the Cooperative Research. She's the Cooperative Research Branch Chief for the Northeast Fishery Science Center. So I know you're on the call, Anna. So whenever you're ready, Anna, you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the council for inviting me to give this presentation today about the Longfin Squid Biological Sampling Program, or as we call it, SQUIBS. We really like our acronyms here. This program has been a collaboration among dozens of scientists and managers, captains, and fishing industry representatives for the last couple of years. And so while I'm here presenting and I'm the lead of this initiative with our council liaison being Jason Didden, I want to flag very early that this was a real team effort to get off the ground, implement, and ultimately bring to conclusion. And being the cooperative research lead here at the Northeast Fishery Science Center, I feel like I need to orient you first as to where this program fits in with our portfolio. There's many ways, of course, that we can and do work with the fishing community to advance scientific understanding of our oceans and resource species. In this particular project, we did this in a couple of ways, and you can see in this infographic those areas circled in red here. First, we were able to sample longfin squid, which is a short-lived species, at a frequency that would have been impossible through any other means by partnering with the fishing community. We did this on a weekly basis, and I'll dig into the details here, but I wanted to flag that this level of sampling that I'm about to explain to you would not have been possible without partnership with the fishing community. Throughout this process in these several years, we also spent a lot of time, in addition to collecting data, really learning from the captains that were collecting samples and from the fishing industry representatives that were helping manage this research project. I wish I had a log of the thousands of phone calls and text messages and conversations in the wheelhouse that we had, because while today I'm going to be presenting you with the quantitative results, those conversations and that information that we gathered through those conversations was just as important for helping us interpret what we're actually seeing in the numbers here. So let's dive in. Why did we do this research? I want to pause for a minute and remind you that this is the other squid. So we spent the last hour or hour and a half or so talking about shortfin squid or Illex squid. This program, SQUIBS, was focused on longfin squid. This squid also is one that we know very little about, particularly its life history. We do know that it's short-lived. It exhibits a seasonal migration, which I've attempted to illustrate here on the top right, where those squids spend the summer months inshore here in southern New England and across the Northeast. Then they migrate offshore in the fall and spend their lives offshore in the winter months. We know that these animals are sensitive to oceanographic conditions. We do not know what is driving them in particular. And we have a hard time understanding that because largely of the mismatch between our traditional data collection approaches, which are our seasonal surveys, and the seasonality of this animal, where we have our spring and fall surveys out on the water. You can see the NOAA ship there in the middle in the spring and fall, whereas this animal is inshore and then offshore for the fishery in the summer and the winter. So they are mismatched in timing. In part because of this, we have little information about the life history of longfin squid, and we have no analytical stock assessment for this stock. The 2023 management track assessment, actually in response to reviewers, highlighted life history as the primary research need for this particular species. And that is why we developed this research program. In addition to the need in terms of the additional science, there was also an opportunity. So there needs to be a need for the research and an opportunity to apply that. And we had this in this context where we had the 2026 longfin squid research track stock assessment ramping up about a year or so after we started this program. So the intent here was to get this research spun up and spitting out results in time to inform the research track stock assessment. We were also at that time working with partners at University of Maryland and VIMS, the council, as well as across the industry to scope and develop new link-based stock assessment models for this model-resistant species. And then finally, as was touched on in the last presentation for Illex, particularly for longfin squid, this is a stock of growing economic importance, particularly as other stocks become less available to the fleet. But it's highly variable from year to year, and we really need more science to understand why that is the case and how we can best manage the stock and this fishery for maximum yield and sustainability. So how do we do it? A key part to this work was collaboration. I'm going to say it over and over again because it was absolutely critical to this work. We could not have designed this program or implemented this program without the partnership of a lot of different people across the academic and research and industry and management realms. So we worked in partnership with a variety of partners to develop the design for this program that matched both the temporal and the spatial scale that is required to understand this stock. That means you need really high resolution information, weekly information. You need it across the entire Northeast continental shelf, and you need to do it in a way that you're getting every bit of biological data that you could possibly need to understand things like growth and reproductive dynamics. So we went through many iterations of design with a large group of scientists and managers in industry to get to the place where we were ready to implement. We also wanted to make sure that we were going to be collecting sufficient sample sizes really to statistically quantify growth and reproductive biology. The worst thing you can do is do a bunch of research and then not have enough information, but you don't want to over collect as well. So we did a lot of work beforehand to make sure we were getting those right sample sizes. We were able to leverage some existing biological sampling methods developed in the 80s by Bill Macy. And adapt those in partnership, again, with a lot of the experts that we were engaging with. And a key piece of this was feasibility as well. We were asking and going to captains every single week for 2 years to collect longfin squid. And so it took a lot of effort to really design this program in a way where we avoided burnout of our industry partners while also achieving the scientific goals. One thing I really want to flag, because I think it demonstrates the commitment of the team that was working on this research, is that we went from a notice that funding is available for this research to our first sample collection and data collection within 2 months. We all know government doesn't always work very fast, but in this case, we really ramped up this program quickly so we would have the data available for the stock assessment. All right, so how did we do this? We know what the goal is, which is understanding the life history of longfin squid, and we took a 10-step approach. So the first thing we did, which I've already touched on, is design this data collection program to really capture the dynamics of the stock. The second thing is we really focused on project documentation. Something we realized very early on is that while there's been other research on longfin squid, the documentation was really, really poor. Very vague descriptions of how you measure different parameters, no photos. If they were maybe black and white sketches. And so we focused a lot of time and effort on developing documentation so that in the future, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years from now, someone can come back and do this research again to understand how the life history of this animal has changed and to do it in a consistent way. In order for us to, again, efficiently collect these data, we also had to develop an electronic data collection system. Fortunately, we were able to leverage the system that we had developed for our industry partners. We have 6 processors who are using electronic measuring boards and scales. You can see in the top right here for Illex size and weight collection actually in the processing facilities. And we were able to adapt that for laboratory work for longfin squid. We then worked hard to coordinate collection of samples, 3 samples, about 100 squid each, from fishing vessels across the Northeast every week for 2 years. And I want to highlight that box here in the middle. We spent a lot of time on the phone. I cannot underestimate or overestimate the amount of time that we spent on the phone or sending text messages or in the wheelhouse. And we're really, really grateful for all the captains who put up with us over these 2 years and continued to help with the collection of these samples. Once we had those squid back at the lab, again, if you keep moving along in these boxes, we recorded a suite of biological characteristics, and I'll go into those in a little bit. You can see Ricardo and Gina recording that information here. And we also collected statoliths, which are simply the equivalent of the fish otolith, to determine the age or the birth date of a subset of the squid that we sampled. We then audited these data for any, of course, scientific endeavor. Data quality is of utmost importance, and we have a standardized and documented data auditing routine that we use to make sure we had fully audited data within 1 week of data collection. In addition to kind of producing these raw data sets, we also produced reports. So we produced monthly reports that went out to both science and industry partners. You can see an example of that here to provide a summary of how much information we've collected and then basic summaries of what length and the weight distributions and reproductive features were looking like. We also produced a report specifically for our captains and included interpretations of the data in those as well. And then finally, we had a real army of people actually working with these data. We made these data available in near real time to the entire longfin squid stock assessment working group. And we had a lot of partnership from John Manderson and Mike Wilberg and Jessica Blaylock and many others, and really digging in and trying to understand what this information is telling us about life history. All right, so very briefly, this is what the SQUIBS sampling system looks like. You have a tablet here that has specialized software on it called Bliss. We have a Bluetooth Morel scale, a electronic Bluetooth scientific measuring board, Bluetooth calipers, and little bar-coded envelopes that you can see with a little squid on them in the bottom left there next to the measuring board. And this is the system we use in the lab to collect all of these data. This is also the system that's used by the 6 processors across the Northeast to collect the Illex size and weight data at the processing facilities. All right, so what did we measure? I could really geek out with you all if you want me to about all of these biological parameters, but I'm not going to do that today. Just going to give you a high-level overview. So you're looking at a female longfin squid that's been cut longitudinally here down her mantle. And on the right here, you have descriptions of all of the parameters that we measured on these female squid. We measured total organism weight, the mantle length, the mantle width, the nidamental gland length, which is the white gland that you can see here in yellow. The accessory gland length, which is a little red gland here that gets redder and redder as they become more mature. We quantified the pigmentation of the accessory gland as an additional way to understand the reproductive maturity. And we classified the abundance of eggs in the ovary, which is simply the presence, stage, and quantity of eggs that are present. And then finally, partway through, about 6 months in to this project, we had the Longfin Squid Population and Fishery Ecology Summit, which brought together about 35 or 40 industry members, scientists, and managers to understand what's going on with this stock. And we added another parameter, which is the presence of sperm packets. So there are a lot of fun little facts about longfin squid and their reproduction. And one of them is that the females actually hold the sperm packets of the males. You can see this circled in red here on the bottom, right next to their beak. And so starting about 6 months into this, we actually started to record which females were holding those sperm packs right next to their beak as an indicator of, ready for prime time, ready to spawn whenever conditions are right. All right, moving on to males. Males is a little bit more simple to characterize their reproductive biology. Again, we measured their organism weight, mantle length, and mantle width. And then we measured their testis length, which is indicated here in the black, as well as the length of an individual spermatophore. So for adult male squid, they have a spermatophoric gland here, and that has these little individual kind of spicules, if you will, that you can extract using forceps, put on your glove, and then measure with a caliper. And that again gives you a sense of how reproductively mature these males are. So again, just to flag, a lot of this was very detailed work in the lab. In addition, I mentioned the collected stateless. You can see a fast-forwarded video here of what it looks like to actually extract stateless. This was one of the training videos that we developed actually for the technicians working on this project. In order to extract stateless, you simply cut into the statocyst, which is what you see them doing right now. And then you use forceps to extract teeny, tiny, which you can see them doing right about now. It'll come right up here. You can extract 2 of them. We preserve those in ethanol, clean them, and then we ship them off to Spain to our partner Angel Gonzalez, who is one of the only squid agers for stateless in the world. Once they were over with Angel, he counted the number of increments, which you can see a schematic of here on the right, where the assumption is that you have one ring, which is both the translucent and the dark ring, per day. There's currently a little bit of a debate here about whether that is that assumption of 1 ring per day is valid, but that has been used for a variety of squids across the globe here. All right, so what did we find? Some preliminary results. One, we have a portable data collection system that can be used both at processing facilities as it is by many of our partners in the fishing community, as well as for a really detailed biological analysis in the lab. We've actually recently started to use this system for Illex squid as well. You can see Mary Kate Munley here. She's actually dissecting some Illex that we sampled on the Durston. And as I mentioned before, we focused really heavily on documentation. So we have detailed sampling designs, protocols, videos. We have a drafted technical memorandum that will live on into perpetuity once we publish it with all the details of how we did this. And we produced 17 monthly data summaries that went directly to our scientific management and industry partners. In addition, I provided an example here on the bottom right of one of the data summaries that we tailored for our captains who collected squid for this research. Oops, did you just lose my presentation?
We did.
Yep, my Chrome just crashed. Hold on just a minute. Apologies.
Yeah, take
All
your
right,
time.
are we back up? Can you see me again? Am I back up?
Well, that was quick. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah, it's back up.
that.
We can see it now.
Thank you. This is unfortunately not unusual that Chrome crashes. Okay, so let me put you back in presentation mode here. Okay, can you see that, Mike?
We can see, yes, we see your presentation again.
Okay, super, thank you. Okay, so on the bottom right here, I was just saying this is an example of one of the data visualizations we developed specifically for captains. So each captain received these summaries every trimester of the data that had been collected through this program, both in terms of numbers as well as through these plots that give them examples of how the length and size and sexual maturity of these animals that they were collecting for us were changing. This was really, really important to us as a step that's often missed in cooperative research, is actually giving back to the captains and our industry partners. So we put a lot of effort into making sure we were communicating and sharing back what we were finding as we were finding it with the captains. And then, as I mentioned, we had a fleet of scientists that we've been working with on analytical products for the research track stock assessment, which I'll go into next. In terms of the totals, prepare yourself to be wowed. We collected and analyzed over 25,000 longfin squid over the course of 2 years. You can see a map of the distribution of where these samples came from. We had 32 different fishing vessels collect samples for us. I'm sure some of them were very annoyed by the end of this 2 years to get more phone calls to ask for squid, but they were champs and were really critical to the success of this work. These samples that were collected came from 15 different statistical areas. You can see all the way from the southern Gulf of Maine down to off of Hatteras. And we collected, in addition to the full samples, over 2,000 statuses. Currently, we have about 1,800 of those that are back to us with ages. And we also collected about 1,500 genetic samples, which you can see are set up for that here on the bottom. We currently do not have samples to actually, we don't have funding to actually work up those genetic samples, but it's something that we're prepared to move forward on if resources are ever available. All right, so let's dig into actually what we found here. What you're looking at here on the right is what's called a ridge plot, where on the x-axis on the bottom there, you have squid size in terms of grams, this is organism weight. And then on the y-axis there, from bottom to top, you're going from April of 2023 to June of 2025, with each of the colors representing the year. So you see those size distributions of squid in each week from 2023 in gray, 2024 in blue, and 2025 in green. We had a minimum mantle length and weight of about 16 millimeters or a ½ inch and 25 grams, and the maximum size of about 379 millimeters or almost 15 inches. That's a real big squid, and 531 grams. And what we noticed throughout the course of this is that these weekly length and weight distributions actually exhibited more consistency throughout the year than we expected. And with discussions amongst the working group and with the industry, we think this might be a potential indicator of continuous spawning as well as of variable growth rates of this animal. The plots that I have here on the bottom are from Mike Wilberg on the Research Track Working Group. And what they're doing is showing you the length-weight relationships, with length on the x-axis and weight on the y-axis, for female squid on the left and male squid on the right. And what you can see is that those length-weight relationships, one, are different between males and females. Males and females grow at different rates. And those length-weight relationships vary by month. And that is likely due to the water temperature and other environmental factors. And the working group has done a lot of work to really use these data to quantify what those temperature-dependent growth rates could be for this animal and integrate those into the stock assessment. Moving on to sexual maturity, again, to remind you, we did use the sexual maturity stage calculations from Macy from the 1980s. And using those calculations, we classified each individual squid into a maturity stage, 0 being immature, 4 being completely mature. And what you're looking at here on the right, again, is a plot of all the maturity stages, where you have gray to blue, immature to mature. 2023 on the left, moving all the way over to 2025, with the season there indicated by the icon. And what you can see is that we do have we observe a higher proportion of sexually mature squid in the spring and summer months. So those are the areas where you see a lot of that light blue and dark blue, and we see that consistently across years. But we do see that the males exhibit sexual maturity in terms of becoming stage 4s and stage 5s all year round. So they are ready to rock at basically basically any time. We are exploring alternative maturity stage definitions, particularly for females. It was challenging, particularly to classify those highest maturity stages for females where we didn't observe fully mature eggs within them. I'm also showing you here on the bottom left what are called ogives. These are simply maturity curves, again, for females on the left and males on the right, where you have length on the x-axis and the proportion of the animals that are mature on the y-axis. These plots are from Mike Wilberg from the Research Track Working Group. And what, again, you can see is that the size at maturity for males and females is different. So the size at which females become sexually mature is different than the size at which males become sexually mature. You will also see, similarly to those length-weight relationships, is that the size at sexual maturity also varies by month. And again, this is something that we believe to be driven largely by environmental conditions that we do not fully understand at this point. Okay, in terms of the ages, we were again able to, we have about 1,800 ages that we received back from our partner over in Spain on Hell. And the minimum age that we have observed or he has counted is 83 days with a maximum age of about 264 days. So this does confirm that indeed this animal is short-lived, living less than a year. And this jives with previous research by Brodziak and Macy in the late 90s that estimated a maximum age of about 256 days, but with a lot less replicates, about 353 rather than 1,800. What you can see in the top plot here is simply the increment count, or basically the age in days on the x-axis and the frequency of those observations on the y-axis, the reddish being female, the bluish being male. What you can see is that there's more blue here on the right tail where these older ages, and what that indicates is that males appear to be achieving older ages than the females. But I do want to note that the distribution of ages for males and females, the difference is not significant. Finally, this plot here on the bottom, which I love this visualization. John Manderson created this, again, a member of the working group. We do have evidence from these ages, if you accept the assumption of 1 ring per day, that there's hatching of longfin squid all year long with 2 primary hatch events. So here you have the day that these animals were caught here on the x-axis, and the day that their estimated hatch here on the y-axis. And what you can see is that there's this December to April hatch that feeds that summer fishery, which is indicated by the red area here. And then you have this May to December hatch that is primarily feeding that fall to winter fishery. Again, I want to mention that there is a current debate about the validity of these statolith aging techniques, but there's a lot of information that we have to learn from the ages and for understanding how these are distributed across time, seasons, and depth. Okay, in terms of the next steps, we are continually working with the working group on different data analyses, which I'm sure they will come back to the council to present more of after that stock assessment is complete. We're also really like to explore more of the environmental drivers for longfin squid life history. We have the ability to do this with this data set. We simply don't have the capacity in terms of the people to really dig into those data. That's something we really like to do in the future, but again, we simply don't have the capacity right now. We are continuing to work on publications as well as a working paper for the Longfin Squid Research Track assessment, and starting to think about how we could apply this approach, which was successful both in operations as well as in scientifically for other species, namely Illex, which ties back to your conversation this morning. Again, this type of work is not possible without a really strong partnership with both captains, on the water captains, as well as other industry representatives. But we do have that for Illex and think we would have a lot to learn about that species if we applied a similar approach. So with that, I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this program. You can see pictures of many of these, but not all of the people here on the right, and I'd be happy to take questions if there's time. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much, excuse me, for your presentation. To members of the council, there is no action needed here, but if anyone has any questions for Anna or would like to make any comments, now would be the time. Michelle.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the awesome presentation, Anna. I'm continually amazed by everything that you and the rest of the cooperative research branch continue to do, especially given resource limitations. Just a quick question in terms of those next steps and, having the capacity to dig into some of those things. Is there, opportunity? I'm just thinking about some of the academic researchers you've been working with that, they might be able to, farm this out to undergrads or grad students as free labor to answer some of these things.
Thank you, Michelle, for the question. 100%. Anyone who's listening and is interested in collaborating on really digging into these data, please reach out. Yes, we are capacity limited, particularly within NOAA and the Science Center right now, but we're very open to partnership, and with the appropriate approvals in terms of NDAs, some of this information is confidential. We can absolutely develop some partnerships to really dig into some of these questions that we haven't yet been able to address with this data set.
All right, thank you. Jason?
I just want to reiterate, thanks to Anna. I don't think we fully envisioned the scope of time and effort that this would take Anna and company when we kind of came to her with this idea, between, again, the outreach to the vessels, mentoring of lab staff. I mean, it was it didn't seem like a Herculean effort as we proposed it, but I think it became that. So thanks, Anna. And we've got a really nice, rich data set that's actively informing the Longfin assessment.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I've got Rich Wong next. Go ahead, Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Anna, what is known about the egg laying habitats? Are there preferences there? Do these species prefer certain types of bottom types for laying their mops? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is something that the Research Track Working Group has started to dig into. Sarah Saloy, when she was with the agency, was doing some research on that. And now Cameron Hodgson with our Population Dynamics branch has been working up some observations from the fleet of egg mop distributions and timing. The Habitat Association is not, as far as I understand, a part of that research to date. I don't want to go into too much depth, recognizing that we are a little bit over time here, but there are seasonal patterns to dropping of those egg mops, as well as what we think is more what it is an actual environmental cue to lay their eggs. Female squid are able to hold on again to those sperm packets and basically fertilize their eggs whenever they want. So they have some plasticity in terms of where they lay those eggs. We really think it's more of an environmental cue. And we see that we have evidence of that egg laying kind of seasonally across the Northeast US continental shelf, not just in those inshore waters south of southern New England, which was traditional understanding.
Anna, thank you again for your presentation. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next item on our agenda. But as always, your enthusiasm and positive energy is infectious, and we hope to hear more from your group at a future council meeting. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see what we've got next. We have one more item on the agenda for this morning. We are going to get a presentation from Dr. John Hare on the Atlantic Sea Scallop Research Track Assessment. So John, whenever you're ready. We don't hear often too much about scallops, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So it's an overview of the 2025 Scallop Research Track Assessment, which was completed this spring. I'm going to talk about the assessment results. I'm not going to talk about the peer review, which was subsequently completed. The assessment results and peer review will be the topic for the New England Council Scientific and Statistical Committee meeting on August 19th. If you have some questions, I can on the peer review, I can try to answer them, but primary purpose today is just to give the council an overview of the research track assessment. So again, like most scientific activities, it takes a lot of people to get the work done. I was not part of the working group. I'm here just to present to the council, but I do want to thank and acknowledge the working group members, Pat Sullivan, Devora Hart, Jonathan Peros, Adam Dezigi, Yuan Chang, Jessica Blaitlock, David Keith, David Rudders, and Amber Lisi. That group worked extremely hard. They started in January of 2023 and completed in March of 2025. The research track assessment was extended for 1 year, so many of those people thought they were signing on to a 1 year effort and signed on for a 2-year effort. So very appreciative of their participation. There were also 19 working group meetings. There was 1 in-person community engagement meeting held in New Bedford, and the peer review was completed April 2025. So research track assessments have a set of terms of reference that the working groups are asked to work on and successfully complete. Those terms of references are listed here. I'll just quick run through them to give you an idea of sort of the scale of the assessment. So 1 was to identify relevant ecosystem and climate influences on the stock. 2 is to estimate catch from all sources, including landings and discards. 3 is present the survey data used in the assessment. 4 is estimate the annual fishing mortality, recruitment, and stock biomass. 5 is update and redefine status determination criteria. 6 is define and document methods for producing projections. 7 is review, evaluate, and report on the status of research recommendations. 8 is develop a backup assessment approach for providing scientific advice to managers. And 9 is identify and consider any additional research recommendations. And what I'm going to do now is just walk through each one of these terms of reference and present sort of the highlights. There's a lot of documentation available with these assessments, and happy to point you to that documentation if you really want to dig into any of the details. So the first term of reference is identify relevant ecosystem and climate influences on the stock. And this is one area where the working group really dug in and made significant progress in addressing past research recommendations. One of the environmental parameters that is known to drive scallop population dynamics is temperature, and we know on the Northeast U.S. shelf temperatures are increasing, and the working group was able to show that bottom temperatures in the mid-Atlantic have been increasing rapidly, and this has had negative impacts on sea scallops at the southern edge of their range. The graph shows the fraction of scallop habitat in the mid-Atlantic impacted by severe heat stress. And you can see that fraction of habitat goes from, near zero in the early 1990s to up to 20% in the mid-2020s. So a significant warming and predicting significant thermal stress to Atlantic sea scallops. This can be seen in the survey distribution. So we have 4 plots. One is dredge survey data from the 1990s, dredge survey data from the 2000s, dredge survey data from the 2010s, and dredge survey data from the 2020s. The blue circles represent the abundance of sea scallops caught. The size of the circle is related to abundance. And as we go from left to right, what you can see is the blue circles in the southern part of the survey go from blue circles to red crosses. And red crosses are areas where no scallops were caught. And looking at the survey data, you can see the scallop population, shifting sort of to the north, as the habitat in that southern mid-Atlantic bight becomes less favorable. And you can also, if you look off of Long Island, you can see the scallop resource shifting offshore as those red squares south of Long Island become evident in the 2020. So we see significant change in the distribution of scallops, and the working group was able to relate that to heat stress experienced by scallops. There are some potentially, positive environmental indicators. One is that solid recruitment was observed in the surveys in 2024. And the hypothesis is that cooler bottom temperatures were observed in the mid-Atlantic in 2024, which led to this increase in recruitment. And we've talked about sort of environmental factors in 2024 being cooler than the past, 5 or 10 years in other species. And so that is also playing out here in terms of scallops. If this pattern continues in 2025, there are prospects for survival of this recruitment event, which occurred in 2024. The NOAA Fisheries Changing Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative, Dr. Vince Saba gave a presentation to this council several meetings ago, has produced forecasting, a 6 to 12 month forecast of temperatures in the Northeast U.S. shelf. That forecast is shown on the right, and that forecast is suggesting cooler than average bottom temperatures in 2025, which could be beneficial to scallop in the mid-Atlantic bight. And we're continuing to use real-time observations collected through the year to evaluate this forecast and improve it. So trying to link together, scallop research track assessment results to NOAA Changing Ecosystem and Fisheries Initiative. Also, in terms of term of reference 1, the working group identified that in terms of ocean acidification, current impacts are likely limited, but more direct effects of ocean acidification will likely occur by mid-century. Mid-century is 2050. We're in 2025, so we're 20 plus years out from seeing direct effects of ocean acidification on Atlantic sea scallops. There is also an increase in the predatory species of sea stars, and that the working group documented. So one from that could assume that natural mortality is likely to be increasing as predators increase for sea scallops. Disease and parasites, there's an increasing prevalence of shell blister disease and a continued high incidence of the nematode infections. There's also noted gray meat disease is still observed in this species. So there are several disease and parasitic concerns as well. And then the invasive tunicate, which is primarily confined to the northern edge of Georges Bank, creates some habitat concerns for sea scallops. So the working group really tried to address all of these ecosystem and climate influences on the stock to set the stage for the remainder of the stock assessment. Term of reference 2 is an estimate catch from all sources, including landings. And there have been historically high landings from about 2000 to 2019. And this graph shows those landings over time, and the colors represent the area from where those landings came. The mid-Atlantic, which is green, and Georges Bank, which is that dark purple, make up the predominant location of landings. And so that 2000 to 2019, you had high landings in the mid-Atlantic and high landings in Georges Bank. And what we've seen in recent years since 2019 is landings in the mid-Atlantic have decreased dramatically, which has also resulted in a decrease in scallop landings in general dramatically. So that's where you pair that up with the dredge survey information that we showed earlier. It's just, restriction of habitat for Atlantic sea scallops in the mid-Atlantic bight, which resulting in lower landings in the mid-Atlantic bight and a decrease in landings for the stock overall. The assessment also, again, asked to document landings and discards. And so the working group went through the discard information as well. Scallops are discarded due to their small size. There's also some high grading in the fishery. You have a limited access trip. Those trips are only landing the largest scallops and potentially discarding scallops to make sure that they're getting the most value out of those trips. There's also this mortality that comes from discarding. On deck, there's a possibility for crushing or high temperature and desiccation, and then the return to the water. Obviously, they're being returned to the surface and need to sink down to the bottom. There's the stress of that activity, possible damage, and possible predation. Discard mortality, once all of these factors are considered, is estimated as 20%, but it could be higher, particularly in the mid-Atlantic in summer because of high temperatures. But the assessment used that 20% for discard mortality. And then in terms of looking at the discard proportion to landing, 5.2% from 1989 to 2023. If you look at a shorter time series, 2010 to 2023, that discard proportion is a little bit higher, 5.9%. It's also variable among region. So then that discard mortality is not used in the assessment model per se because the percentage is low, but it is going to be used in the projection model for estimating catch going forward. Term of reference 3, present the survey data used in the assessment. With Atlantic sea scallops, there's a number of different surveys that are conducted to support the assessment and management of the species. Atlantic sea scallops is one of the fisheries where there is a research set aside. A proportion of the quota is set aside to be used to support scientific activities, research projects, and survey activities. So there is a lot of survey data available to support Atlantic sea scallop management. Dredge surveys are used. They've been used historically. That's how scallops are harvested. Northeast Fisheries Science Center and Virginia Institute of Marine Science conduct dredge surveys. Drop camera survey, you put a camera on the bottom and photograph a known area. That survey is done by University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And then HabCam surveys, that's a towed vehicle that images the bottom, and you can count scallops from those images, similar to the drop camera survey. Northeast Fisheries Science Center and Coonamessett Farm Foundation conduct HabCam surveys. And there are a couple of other survey activities that are also contribute, but the point is that the research set aside partners, academic and industry, are key to collecting the wealth of survey data that we have to support management for Atlantic sea scallops. These are trends from that survey data. The top are the dredge surveys, which are combined Northeast Fisheries Science Center and Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And then the bottom are the dredge survey in red, the drop camera in blue, and the HabCam surveys in green. The time period of those bottom plots is shorter than the time period of the top plots because the dredge surveys have been ongoing longer than the drop camera and HabCam surveys. Looking at the dredge surveys first, you see a low biomass per tow up to about mid-1990s, and then an increase up, high point sort of early 2000s, and then in Georges Bank, a slow decrease to present time. Looking at the mid-Atlantic, that pattern is similar, with the exception that the decrease from the early 2000s to the 2020s is much more drastic. And that comports with the catch data that I showed earlier, where catches are decreasing in the mid-Atlantic and survey indices are decreasing in the mid-Atlantic. Looking at the different ways to survey, the dredge, drop camera, HabCam, in general, these different techniques are similar. Particularly when you look at the mid-Atlantic trends, all three survey methodologies are lining up with the possibility that the drop camera and HabCam are a little bit higher in sort of 2015, 16, 17 time period. And then we see that again in Georges Bank. The trends in the dredge survey are not as noticeable as they are in the mid-Atlantic, and we see that increase in HabCam and drop camera in the 2016, 17, 18. The cause of that is not quite clear, but all of this survey data is used in the assessment, which again provides more confidence in the assessment results. So the term of reference 4 is estimate annual fishing mortality, recruitment, and stock biomass. The Atlantic Scallop stock assessment uses a catch at size analysis, which is a size structured model. This model has been used for sea scallops with progressive enhancements since 2007. The assessment models were run for 3 different regions: the Mid-Atlantic, the Georges Bank closed areas, and the Georges Bank open areas. And then the results of these models were combined to get to the total assessment for the stock. So we have 3 plots here. I'm going to walk through each one from left to right. The assessment model estimates biomass, and this estimated biomass generally agrees with the surveys. And so that is the plot on the lower left. What we have there, it's hard to read the legends, I understand, but we have the estimated, the model estimated abundance, and the different survey estimated abundance. And what you see is all of those lines are basically overlapping one another. So there's close agreement between the survey indices and the model results. Looking at fishing mortality, mortality has declined in the Mid-Atlantic as effort has shifted to Georges Bank. And you see that in that middle plot. That middle plot is fishing mortality over time. And you see, a slow decrease and then really dropping off at the, the endpoints in the time series used in the model. And then there has been poor recruitment noted in 2018 to 2023. That's not shown, but what is shown is the estimate of natural mortality from the model. And you see in the later time series in the blue increases in estimated natural mortality. Those increases could come from the increases in temperature or increases in predators, increases in disease and parasites. So there's a number of factors which sort of support this idea of increased mortality in the Mid-Atlantic bight. Looking at a similar sort of layout of information for the Georges Bank closed area, the estimated biomass generally agrees with the surveys. Biomass declined from 2015 to 2020, but has increased a little bit recently. Looking at fishing mortality in that middle plot, fishing mortality initially was very high, came down, and then has been increasing over time. Again, as the catch has shifted to the Georges Bank area, there's more fishing effort there. And then the natural mortality, again, shows an increase in the later part of the estimated model estimates. But it is important to note that the scale of natural mortality for the Georges Bank plot is different than the scale on the previous plot. So natural mortality is lower in Georges Bank than it is in the Mid-Atlantic. Then for the Georges Bank open areas, biomass has been fairly steady in recent years. There's a lot more variability or the estimated biomass from the stock assessment model and the surveys are not quite as much of agreement in the other 2 areas. Again, there's more variability in the data, and this one model has the most uncertainty resulting from the variable information coming from the survey indices. Fishing mortality has declined since its peak around 1992, but it has been somewhat higher in recent years, again, with this shift in fishing effort from Mid-Atlantic to Georges Bank. Natural mortality in this model is not estimated independently, and it uses the natural mortality estimates from the Georges Bank closed area. Term of reference 5 is update or redefine the status determination criteria. This term of reference uses a different model. It uses a stochastic yield model that takes into account the uncertainty of the different parameters that are used in the model. There are two stochastic yield models that were run, one for the Mid-Atlantic and one for Georges Bank. And then these two are combined to get an overall stock level status determination criteria. And so what we see is Mid-Atlantic, which is in red, is sort of really like it doesn't have much shape to it. It just increases slowly and then decline slowly. And what we're looking for is the fishing mortality at maximum sustainable yield. And for the Mid-Atlantic, it's quite high. It's at 1.56. So that red curve with that slowly increasing, this means is that 1.56 is where that curve reaches its maximum before it starts trending down again. Looking to Georges Bank, FMSY is much better defined. It's at 0.36, so it's at where that blue dotted line reaches its peak. That's 0.36. And then these two estimates are combined to get to the stock total FMSY, which is 0.49. So that's that black line, and 0.49 is where that black line reaches its maximum and then trends down afterward. So that's the sort of fishing mortality reference point for the two areas independently and then for the combined stock. So when we look at sort of these looking at the stock overall, the black line is the biomass, the black dotted line is the biomass, maximum sustainable yield, and then underneath that is the biomass threshold. The biomass at maximum sustainable yield is 93,282 metric tons. That threshold value is 1/2 of the biomass maximum sustainable yield, which is 46,641 metric tons. And the current biomass at the stock level is below the BMSY target, but above the threshold. So this assessment is concluding that the stock is not overfished. It is important to comment or caveat, and the working group spent time to prepare this analysis. It's looking at two different models and combining them to get to a stock, one stock similar to black sea bass. But when you look at those two separate units, you get a different answer. And this plot is very noisy. It's sort of, I'm just going to walk through it. So the black line that goes up and down in this is the fully recruited fishing mortality for the combined stock. And then that combined combo FMSY is the black dotted line. So the fully recruited fishing mortality is under the combined FMSY for the stock. So we're saying that overfishing is not occurring for that combined Georges Bank and Mid-Atlantic stock. And when we look at those two separate areas, the Mid-Atlantic bite is the red information, so that dotted line up around 1.5 on the y-axis, and then that dotted sort of trend line way down near the bottom on the far right is Mid-Atlantic. So the Mid-Atlantic is well below the overfishing limit. But Georges Bank, looking at the sort of the blue line, the blue line is above the Georges Bank FMSY. So if we were looking at Georges Bank on its own, we would conclude that overfishing is occurring. And this nuance is something that New England Council and the SSC and the Scallop PDT and the Science Center is going to work through in terms of setting the catch specifications for the 2026 period. And I'm sure it'll be a topic for discussion at the upcoming SSC meeting. Going into the sort of the other parts of the terms of reference, term of reference 6 is define and document the methods for producing projections. Projections in Atlantic Scallop uses a third model. It uses a Scallop area management simulator. Scallop is managed in very discrete areas, and so it's not just projecting the abundance over a total stock area. It's projecting in each of these areas, so then New England Fisheries Management Council can sort of move the fishery around in open access areas and closed access areas. The population dynamics in the Scallop area management simulator are similar to the CASA, to the stock assessment model, and the SIM, the reference point model, but they're modeled for each SAM's area. So it's a smaller scale than the other two areas, the other two models. And one thing which, you know, in doing these analyses and has been clear or been suggested for a period of time, and the working group really sort of dug in to be able to visualize this, is that in the mid-Atlantic area, those catch projections have consistently overestimated biomass. So these are the catch projections in each year compared to the realized catch. And so if you think of that realized catch as being 0, and then the catch projections are shown in those boxes. If you look, those red boxes are consistently over that realized catch reference line of 0. So we understand this, the working group documented this, and the working group, you know, in terms of diagnosing this, believes it's because of the underestimation of natural mortality and an overestimated recruitment. The working group did recommend that natural mortality be increased both in the Mid-Atlantic Bight and in Georges Bank, and increased natural mortality more in the Mid-Atlantic Bight than in Georges Bank. And sort of the intent or the hypothesis, as it were, that this may have the projections coming out of the SAMS model be more in line with the subsequent realized catch. And that will be looked at more as we go through the catch setting specification process later this summer and into the fall. Where the Science Center has been continuing to work and is not yet completed is working on a more geographically discrete SAMS model. So as I said, you know, going back, this model is calculated for these different boxes. But, you know, these different boxes, you know, there's geography to these different boxes. So the Science Center is working on a model which estimates catch in a much more fine resolution that can then be summed over the management areas by the council. We've been this has not been completed yet, and we're still working on it. We did sort of have to pause this for a little while because of some funding constraints, and this is an effort that we would be looking to restarting and completing hopefully in the near future. In terms of term of reference 7, reviewing and evaluating and reporting on the status of research recommendations, the working group went through previous stock assessments, SARC 65, the 2020 management track, went through the annual SSC reports from 2020 to 2024, cataloged all the research recommendations that were made, and then evaluated how they had been addressed or not addressed. And so some of the highlights in terms of what has been addressed, you know, Center has developed a generalized random tessellation stratification methods for the survey designs, and that will help primarily the dredge surveys use the same amount of dredge survey effort, but get greater precision into the abundance estimates coming out of that effort. So that's an area, there was a recommendation, and it has been taken. The other recommendation is a number of recommendations related to evaluation of environmental and ecosystem processes on sea scallops dynamics. And term of reference 1 really dug into those recommendations and made significant progress. Where the working group saw this area for continued effort, where research recommendations had not yet been met, the GeoSAMS model, which we talked about earlier, still on the list to do, is develop spatially explicit methodology for forecasting the abundance and distribution of scallops. And so that's something the Science Center is going to work to, continue to work to find resources for and complete. And then further refine and test methods for forecasting landings per unit effort. That's related to that, the projections. As I showed before, we know particularly in Georges Bank, the projections are over. So how can we, have projections better match what is realized? So those are 2 research recommendations that are still on the list to complete. In terms of term of reference 8, develop a backup assessment approach. Working group sort of document the, relatively straightforward approach if a model were to fail in peer review, if the CASA model were to fail in peer review. So if the CASA model fails, we use a swept area from survey estimates. And again, there is a wealth of survey data here to support. But we do prefer to use the modeling approaches. If the SIM model fails for setting reference points, we can use a deterministic calculation for those reference points. If both the assessment model and the reference point model fail, we can use swept area survey estimates with average catch to estimate appropriate exploitation rates. And then, the SAMS model, that projection model, it can't really fail because it's they're just mathematical calculations, but they are dependent on inputs from the CASA model, primarily natural mortality. So if the CASA model fails, SAMS will need to make assumptions regarding natural mortality for those calculations to be completed. So the working group, documented this is what we do as a backup if our models that have been developed are deemed to not be, best scientific information available. That has not happened yet, but we have a backup plan if that were to happen. Then in terms of a term of reference 9, identify and consider any additional research recommendations. There are, so not a long list, but there are some recommendations there. One that I want to highlight is, most of the surveys, most of the sort of modeling effort, most of the scientific effort is focused on Georges Bank and Mid-Atlantic, but the Scallop resource continues to, create economic benefits in the Gulf of Maine. And so the, recommendation, doing a better job surveying, better job understanding the dynamics of the Gulf of Maine Scallop resource is an important future research recommendation for the Science Center to take into account. The research set-aside program funds several projects in the Gulf of Maine. So continue, obviously, doing that work in the Gulf of Maine. And then if the opportunity presents, the Science Center to start doing more work in the Gulf of Maine as well. So that's just the sort of walking through the results of the research track assessment. I'm happy to try to answer any questions that any of you may have. And again, there'll be a discussion of the assessment, the peer review, and setting the stage for the catch specification process at the August 19th New England Council Scientific and Statistical Committee meeting. So, Mr. Chair, I open it up to you for questions.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that very comprehensive report. I'm going to look to members of the council for questions at this time, or comments. We can take both. We'll start with Jim Gilmore, and then Greg, I'll come over to you next. Jim?
Thanks, Chairman. And yeah, great presentation, John. Can you go back to terms of reference 1, that time series graph? The thing that, go just past it. Go back to the next slide. That one. The time series, a lot of the things with the biomass that are reacting to climate change and temperature seem to have this either this gradual shift to the north, whatever. It seems to be rather striking that from 2016 to 2023, it's like a truncation. There's no progression north, so it's not even connected to the Gulf of Maine any longer, or Georges Bank. Is any idea why it's almost like it collapsed as opposed to it's migrating north?
Yeah, I mean, scallops. So scallops don't migrate, right? They're benthic. And you see a similar dynamic with, the Atlantic surf clam, Jim Weinberg's 2005 paper. So that was a long time ago. And so the assumption is that the scallops in the south, they're not moving, they're dying. And this is, looking at 4 years out of a time series and looking only south of Montauk. I think you're right. It would be interesting to look at this over the entire range of the survey. But that 2016 to 2023 step is, noticeable. And I think, that we had, 2012 was the warmest year on record in the ecosystem. And then we had a number of, very warm years, subsequent. So 4, 5 warm years subsequent to that 2012. And so I think it's probably the accumulation of inhabitable bottom temperatures that is, causing this large change in distribution in the 2010s and 2020s. But, I think it'd be useful to look at this as a full time series. I agree.
Okay, thank you. Greg Hewitt.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Thanks, Sean. Really good. What is really causing, do you think, the disease and everything and the spread of that throughout this the system and the scallops themselves? It seems to it's something that's been going on for the last couple of years, and it seems to be, getting, for lack of a better word, larger as well, and growing. So, is there any idea of is it temperature, water, or what is it exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I will go back and check and then get back to the council, go through the Term of Reference 1 report and see if they have made any clear links between the nematode and gray meat disease and that wasting disease relative to, environmental or other things. But I don't know offhand, but I can check and see if there's more information on that for you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else at the table with any questions, comments? Is there anyone in the audience that has anything they'd like to ask or comment on? Anyone online? Seeing no hands. Jason.
I'll just note that Mid-Atlantic Council staff does track scallop things. So if you may not know the answer, but we can probably figure out who to direct you to if council members do have questions. Michelle's on the committee. Peter Hughes was on the committee. So we do have some representation of the Mid-Atlantic into the process. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Seeing no other hands around the table or online, thank you, John, for your presentation. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
That will conclude the business before the council here this morning. We're going to adjourn the council meeting at this time. When we pick up after lunch, we will be meeting jointly with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Interstate Fishery Management Plan Policy Board. That board is chaired by Joe Cimino. And so he and I will be navigating the after lunch session. So come on back at 1 o'clock and we'll pick things back up. Thank you.